At this point in the history of political philosophy, we're starting to see a gradual shift from theories about justice and how to organize society in such a way that it leads to human flourishing to theories about economics. And there are several factors that led to this shift. There were social, political, economic realities of the time, and those realities demanded that new theoretical frameworks would be developed for understanding how power and governance actually works. So we're living during the Enlightenment period at this point. And so one of the changes that happened was a transition from feudalism, which during the medieval period was the economic system in which land was granted in exchange for, say, loyalty or military service or labor, which that created a hierarchy. So there's lords, vassals, and serfs. So there's a shift away from that to a market-based economy, which we see in the 16th and 17th centuries. And that shift made economics more central when thinking about how we should govern society. And for that reason, philosophers had to take into account the relationship between political power and economic systems. So we see this most clearly perhaps in the writings of Adam Smith. So Adam Smith was a philosopher and a Scottish economist. He's often regarded as the father of modern economics, promoting a capitalist system. So in his writings, he emphasizes a free market, the division of labor, self-interest as being a virtue rather than a vice. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. And he also promotes what he calls the invisible hand. Each of these concepts we're going to be getting into. But one of the things that's important to recognize with Smith is that he's building on the ideas of John Locke. Now, that's not to say that he has the same exact moral theory as John Locke. He doesn't. For Locke, he is arguing that liberty is the foundational value. Smith doesn't argue that way. Smith is a consequentialist. A consequentialist is somebody who argues that you can determine whether an action is right or wrong based upon the consequences of an action. When we get to Jeremy Bentham, you're going to see that he is also a consequentialist. And the most common form of consequentialism is that which is promoted by Jeremy Bentham, which is a principle called utilitarianism. We're going to get there in a moment. But Smith is a consequentialist saying that we should try to protect free trade because that will be a benefit for all of society. That is the argument that Smith is going to be making. John Locke argues that protecting rights is a fundamental good, which is why for Locke, he argued that government is supposed to protect life, liberty, and property. That is the role of government. So Smith agrees with that, even though he disagrees with Locke's foundational principle. Now, for Locke, when you're talking about property, remember, derives from labor, which means when you look at your possessions, what makes those possessions yours? John Locke's argument is that if you go into the state of nature, and let's say you come across an apple tree, who do those apples belong to? Those apples don't belong to anyone until someone uses their labor to go pick the apples. The moment you use your labor to pick the apples, those apples now become your possession. That's what it means to own something, to have property. And once you have that property, Locke argues that people should be free to trade as they see fit. Well, now this leads into a critique during Smith's time, during Locke's time. If we promote free trade, why should we think that free trade will lead to rational ends? Or what are the odds that any of this will lead to flourishing? Because remember, the way that the Greek philosophers were arguing, and this was also true when you get into the Christian political theory of Augustine and Aquinas, but the way all of these thinkers are arguing is that government is responsible for shepherding human societies. Now, I should say all of them are thinking that. Augustine, remember, is thinking that government is just meant to restrict evil. Locke is following the Augustinian tradition, saying that government is just to protect life, liberty, and property. But if you're going to have that type of system, and government is not going to shepherd human societies, then what is governing everything? Why would we think it would be rational? If we're just allowing people to trade freely in the market, they're not looking out for the greater good. And Smith has an answer to this question. It was raised during the time of Locke, but Smith's answer is that self-interest will eventually create general prosperity and a wealthier nation. That's his argument. By allowing people to pursue their own rational ends, that will lead to the greater good of the whole. So this is the case that he's going to make in his Wealth of Nations. So there's several ideas that are important to understand when reading through his work. So the first idea is the division of labor. So Smith argues that the most efficient way to create productivity is through specialization. So he describes a pin factory where the production of pins is divided into many distinct tasks. So instead of one person making the entire pin, if each worker specializes in one specific part of the process, so some will draw the wire, some will cut it, some will sharpen it, etc., that will create overall production of pins, which would not be possible if just one person was doing it themselves. So why is this significant? Because that's going to lead to greater efficiency and productivity. When you have people doing a greater amount of work in the less amount of time, that creates an increased supply. So what works for the pin factory works for any factory. So all of a sudden you have an increased supply of things, which means the cost of those things will go down and more people will be able to have the things. So now if factories are created like this in an efficient process all over the world, eventually the exchange of goods and services will be important. And this is where he promotes the ideas of free markets, competition, and the invisible hand. All of these things are going to be considered a moral good for Adam Smith. Because when individuals are allowed to freely exchange, it will create a competitive market that eventually leads to prosperity. So it's important to note that Smith is departing from common ideas of his day. Many people saw competition as being something that would divide a society. Smith is arguing the exact opposite. It's the competition that will make society better. Many people saw that people focused on their own self-interest will, again, divide society. But he's arguing actually this will make individuals and society at large better. He argues that competition is the great regulator. This is his writings here. The great regulator of all transactions. And it is the competition which, by directing the efforts of the individuals to the interests of society, and it's that process which brings about the most beneficial results. And so this gets into his idea of the invisible hand. When you allow that process to work out, that is, individuals acting out of self-interest, that will unintentionally lead to the public good. That's the invisible hand. It's guiding resources to their most productive use. So now if that argument is true, then this leads into his idea about the role of government. So he's very similar to John Locke here. He argues that the purpose of government is to protect rights, administer justice, provide defense. That's all John Locke. But then he also adds that it's probably beneficial for the government to create infrastructure, public infrastructure, that allows the market to be more productive. But it's the job of the markets to create the good life. So here you're starting to see that in the ancient philosophers, the government's job is to shepherd human society to the greater good. When you get to Augustine and John Locke, the government is limited to just restricting evil or protecting life, liberty, and property with Locke. For Augustine, the shepherding role is the role of the church. That's what's going to provide the reason, the justice, is the church is supposed to take on that role. Now, during the Enlightenment period, it's not going to be the institution of the church. In fact, there's not going to be an institution. Smith is arguing the market can take that job. The market is the one that is going to lead to human flourishing. You don't need it to have a top-down structure. This could happen completely bottom-up. A few other ideas to just mention, or one other idea to mention with Adam Smith that's important. In all of this, what he's promoting is the labor theory of value, which means that the value of a good, so when we're trading goods and services, the value of that good is determined by the labor required to produce it. That's right in the tradition of John Locke. But what that means is the idea of wealth for Smith is production, which means he's rejecting mercantilism, which is the idea that wealth is measured by the saving or hoarding of currency, the gold and the silver. He rejects that idea. That's not what makes you wealthy. What can gold do? What can silver do? What makes a nation wealthy is what it can produce. And for that reason, the good society is the wealthy society. And we become wealthy when we trust the invisible hand of the market and recognize the value of individuals pursuing their own self-interest, because that leads to production. So that is Adam Smith. Again, he is a consequentialist, that we protect free rights and we protect the individual for the purpose of the greater good, which leads into the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was also a consequentialist, a specific type of consequentialist called a utilitarian. So he started his education at Oxford at age 12. He graduated from law school at age 15 and completed his bar exam at the age of 19, but he never practiced law. Instead, he became a philosopher and an ethicist, a professor within the university, and is considered the father of utilitarianism, which is a specific form of consequentialism that says what it means to do a right action is to do whatever it is that promotes the greatest good, or more specifically, the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. Or you can put that principle in the negative and say an action is considered right if it reduces harm or pain for the most amount of people. And so for Bentham, just a fun little background here, when he was coming to the end of his life, he wondered, what could I do to maximize happiness for the greatest amount of good in my death? Because obviously he's not going to know anything. He's going to be dead. And for whatever reason, he thought that the way to maximize happiness is to have his body preserved, to have it mummified, and to be put on display at the University College of London. And to this day, you can find his body. His head fell off, and so they put a wax head on him today, but you can still see it. And you have his actual head just sitting there at his feet. Now, I don't know if that did contribute to the greatest amount of happiness, but Bentham was trying to be true to his principle all the way to the end. So his principle is the principle of utility. And this is how Bentham describes it. It's that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. In other words, if an action creates happiness, it's good. If it creates pain, then it's bad. That's the principle of utility. Now, it's important to note that Bentham is departing from a common idea, much like Smith departed from the idea that self-interest is a vice, and so Smith argues that it's actually a virtue, self-interest. Bentham is going to do a similar thing with emotions and reason. Bentham argues that emotions are good, and reason does not help with figuring out what is right or wrong. It's the emotions. That is in complete contrast with the Greek philosophers of, say, Plato and Aristotle, who argued that if we're going to shepherd a human society, we have to do it according to reason. Bentham argues that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Those are both emotions. And it's for them alone to point out what we ought to do. So rather than ruling by reason, or at least starting with reason, Bentham argues we need to start with pain and pleasure. And when we do that, politics can become a science that we can measure the right or the wrongness of a thing, and not speculation. And by speculation, he's thinking of just philosophy. He wants politics to become a science and not just a philosophy. And so if it's going to be a science, you have to come up with a calculus. And he does this. He comes up with this pleasure-pain calculus, in which he tries to measure pain and pleasure in terms of units or lots. So if an action leads to pleasure, that is considered good. If it leads to pain, that's considered bad. That's considered immoral. And we can measure this by going through a very detailed process. So Bentham argues that whenever you're trying to determine whether or not this action is good or bad, ask first, what is the intensity of the pain or the pleasure that it's leading to? And then contrast that with the duration. Because there are some pains and pleasure that are very intense, but that are gone in 5 seconds. Like think of ripping off a Band-Aid. So it's an intense pain, but it only lasts for 5 seconds, so it's not a big deal. But if you have a pain that is intense, that lasts for years, you have to put a lot of moral weight into that. He also says we need to consider the certainty or uncertainty of the pain and pleasure in question. Because remember, he's a consequentialist. So you don't know whether an action is right until you see the consequences of the action. So if you're doing an act and you're certain that this is going to lead to pain, then you shouldn't do it. If you're uncertain, then that gives you a little more wiggle room. But you have to take that into account. He says you also have to take into account the closeness or the remoteness. Now, not all utilitarians agree with Bentham on this, but what he's arguing is that we should give greater weight to those who are close to us and less weight to those who are far removed from us. And that is what you take into account when you're considering the units or the lots. Then he says it's important to recognize that there are some pleasures that lead to pleasure, and that lead to pleasure for the long term. Those are considered morally good actions. Then you have some pains that just lead to further pains. Those are considered immoral actions. You shouldn't do those. But then you have some pleasures that in the moment they bring about pleasure, but later they're going to bring about pain, and they're going to bring about pain for the duration. In those actions, Bentham would say those actions are immoral. If it starts with pleasure but leads to pain, you shouldn't do it. Then you have some actions which begin with pain, but they lead to pleasure. So you could think of something like, with both of these, working out would be something where it's painful at the beginning, but if you work out every single day, that leads to more pleasure in your life, and that's considered a good thing to do. Maybe if you only eat chocolate cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like maybe you could argue that brings pleasure at the beginning, but if you have a diet that's nothing but chocolate cake, that will lead to pain in your life. That's considered bad. So all of this has to be taken into account. And once you consider all of this, then he asks about the extent. How many people are affected by this action? So doing this is his way of measuring ethics. Measuring, because really it's just measuring pain and pleasure. And this is what makes ethics a science and what makes political philosophy not a philosophy, but a science. So how do you actually use this? Well, there's two schools of thought. There are act utilitarians who would try to use this for every moral judgment. Most philosophers, however, and Bentham is included in this, would say that's just not practical. You can't use this principle for every moral judgment. That would take too much time. Instead, you should be a rule utilitarian, which means you can use this process for legislative or judicial operations. In other words, if you use this process to create laws that help you govern society, that will lead to beneficial ends. But the big idea is that the community is more important than the individual, and that is Bentham. John Stuart Mill agrees with Bentham on the utilitarian principle. His father James Mill was a student of Bentham, and so he gets a lot of these ideas from his father. And evidently his parents pushed him really hard in life. So he knew Greek at the age of 3, Latin at the age of 8, and by the age of 10, John Stuart Mill wrote a history of the Roman law. And as you can imagine, by age 20, he had a nervous breakdown where he was depressed for 5 years until he met the love of his life, Harriet, and then he began to snap out of it, and he became a defender of the utilitarian principle. But for Mill, what he wanted to do is humanize the principle. Instead of making it a science like Bentham, he wanted to argue more for the qualitative happiness and not just the quantitative happiness. And so he writes that many people are critical of the happiness principle, but really he agrees with Bentham in saying that there's no other way to articulate what is meant by a moral faculty. Like, how do you know what's right and wrong? How do you know what is just and unjust? You're really talking about what's promoting happiness for the greatest amount of people. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing.